Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Shaw. This is the Data Entrepreneurs. We are a community of entrepreneurs who are pursuing ventures around AI, data science, and other similar technologies. I'm super excited to have Keith here today because he's going to be talking about what he's learned and his incredible insights from being in this space for over 30 years. And so I first came across Keith through a LinkedIn learning course, something about like data science side hustles. And that was perfect for me because I was working as a data scientist full-time at Toyota, and I was curious about getting to doing this entrepreneurship thing on a bigger scale. And I was getting a lot of ideas from Keith's course. And then ever since, Keith has just been like a really good mentor, and I've learned a lot from him. So I'm really excited for him to come on and share his experiences so you guys can learn as much as I have from him. So with all that, I'll just hand it over to you, Keith, and you can get into the talk.
Okay, so I'm just going to use the slides for my own reference. If you see me looking up in the sky, I'm just glance at those. So Sean and I were just talking about kind of like timeline stuff. So I did undergrad between 86 and 91. So I'm an older guy, but not elderly, certainly. I think of myself as mid-career. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this all started as early as 91. In fact, this is a detail, Shaw, that I think is going to be unfamiliar to you. So I guess I always had the entrepreneurial spirit, and between 91 and 94, I had a tutoring business. So the reason that got started is, of course, here in the U.S., that in fact internationally, the SAT is a big deal if you want to get into a American university. So I was one of those students that was kind of inconsistent in the classroom, but always tested well. So I got into doing that as side hustle, actually, while I was still in school. And I was actually on an Army scholarship too, which really limited my options. So I thought for sure that I would be full-time military when I graduated, but like all things in the Army, you don't make decisions like that. They make that for you. So suddenly I graduated, wasn't going to be forced to do the Army, which was fine with me, but it left me with, what am I going to do? And I've been thinking about being entrepreneurial for a while. So the main reason that I didn't continue to do the tutoring business and try to grow it is that I relocated from Massachusetts, where I did undergrad, to North Carolina. I'm still in North Carolina now, so I've been in this house this year. And in fact, July of this year will be 30 years because my friends and I moved here. I live alone in the house now, but in my 20s, it was a bunch of us all going to school down here, and I thought I was going to pursue PhD work in Chapel Hill. UNC Chapel Hill had a really good department in psychometrics. Psychometrics is kind of stats-infused psychology. So if that sounds a little surprising, given that I've turned out to be a data scientist, at the time it wouldn't have been. Because at the time, if you were going to be serious about doing data science type things, we didn't use the phrase. Really, there was kind of an expectation that you would get a master's or a PhD in something stats related, more so than a computer science degree at the time. That obviously didn't last. Now I think people would find that to be a distraction, certainly at the PhD level. I even know a successful data mining consultant that says that, somebody would be ruined if they went all the way to PhD work in stats. But at the time, that wasn't, atypical at all. So as a way to bring in extra money while going to grad school ultimately didn't happen. If you look at my LinkedIn, I don't have a PhD, but it was really just a way to pick up extra money. I started teaching SPSS classes, SPSS software classes for SPSS Inc. At the time, SPSS and SAS, they're still big companies. SPSS has since been bought by IBM. But again, in this space, you wouldn't think of it today. You would think you really have to learn, something like Python. But back then, you would get a stats degree, you would learn a stats package, and the statistics packages had this increasingly large machine learning functionality. So that's how I got started. And I was freelancing. So one way to think of it is I was kind of a freelancer before I was an entrepreneur, and that I really didn't have a business in any sense. I didn't have my own website. I wasn't selling my own services, but I was working by the day. And I'm not quite sure how I knew that this was the right route for me to go, But since I started out with this very small, tiny business where in the same town where I was an undergrad, I sensed that I didn't want to be limited. And one of the themes, I think, of my experience has been that depending on your career path, you kind of leaving yourself with options or not so many options. Like if, let's say, as an extreme example, somebody out of their undergrad or more likely master's program goes to a place like McKinsey, you're going to be lucky if you have time to eat and sleep. You're certainly not going to be doing side hustle if you're going a route like that. So the reason that I chose to be a freelancer with SPSS Inc. was really that's what they first offered. 2, I was thinking about doing grad school, so full-time wasn't an option for me. But 3, I just had this vague sense in the back of my mind that if I went the freelancing route, I would have options, but if I went a full-time route, I'd have fewer options. Certainly, I wasn't prepared to close the door to grad school. I wanted to keep my options open. So some of the advantages of freelancing, I think some of them were obvious. It's just expected if you're freelancing that you can have side hustle. So having 2 freelancing jobs on top of each other, if you're young like I used to be, and you want to do 60 hours a week and pull, some all-nighters and spend a lot of time on a plane, I'm almost, when I say almost, it's still going to take me another couple of years, but my next threshold with Delta will be 2 million miles. I'm up around 1.8 now. And you get some cool things when you achieve, I don't know if that's the right word, a threshold like that. You have status like for lifetime and things like that. I have 3,000 hotel nights with Hilton, probably more. That was the last time I counted. It's probably substantially more now. I've got 1,000 nights with Marriott. Think about that. That's more nights in hotel rooms than I've been here in the house over 30 years. Although with shutdown that changed. So that's really how it all started, was just kind of leaving my options open. So I started doing the SPSS stuff in 97. And then in 99, a couple of interesting things happened. SPSS bought a company that made predictive analytics software. So that opened the door to kind of not just training, but consulting. And then a client who liked me from training reached out to me and said, we have this part-time research role. Once every 10 years, we do this big retroactive, it was a golf research, believe it or not. So it was, golf marketing, right? It's a company called the National Golf Foundation that still exists. It's a part for-profit, part nonprofit out of Jupiter, Florida, which is a beautiful place if you've never been. And they reached out to me and said, we're advertising this part-time research role. Can you do it? Now, this was a key moment for me in a number of ways because I learned some important lessons when this happened. I learned the importance of transparency, and I learned a little bit about how companies see full-time employees and freelancers. So in theory, I was free to do anything I wanted because I was a freelancer. But if I had just done that and hadn't been transparent about it, I could be accused of stealing a client, which I would never in a million years do, because you do that once, those relationships are ruined forever. I mean, I don't just mean they'll be mad for a few months. I mean, you will never work with that client again. You'll never work with that company again. These are permanent severing relationships. So you just never, ever do it. So what made the difference is they were advertising this as a part-time research role. So clearly it wasn't a consulting gig that SPSS Inc. was going to get. So it's fully transparent. I forward everything to the boss. They get in touch with the client and they said, we would never score this gig anyway. Go for it. But did so with their blessing. But that was my first consult. That was the first time that I was being paid to consult as opposed to training. And I learned so much through that experience. I mean, I had to do things like do my own invoicing and write my own contracts and answer questions like, am I retaining the IP and all this other stuff. So I didn't realize how big a deal that was. But in retrospect, it really was. So that continued for quite a while, where really I was more a freelancer than anything else. But when these gigs came along, they literally had to fall into my lap for me to get them because I wasn't chasing after them. I was free to pursue them because I stayed freelance. And every other year or so, SPSS would say, do you want to come full time? And I was just like, I don't see any advantages in me doing that. In fact, I was working more days per year than the full-timers were because they had vacation. And I would take vacation when a class was canceled. That's kind of how I did it. But I never turned down a gig because I wanted to have time off. I figured that I'm going to have some time off naturally from losing gigs. So that was, that was kind of an important thing, and that established. But there was no sense of personal branding. In 2009, IBM bought SPSS, and that was the biggest milestone in my career in the sense that I never had pursued the PhD. My livelihood was around my knowledge of SPSS. Now, you all are actually in an interesting position to reflect on what that meant, because you would go, gosh, how on earth can anybody have a career knowing SPSS? Who cares about SPSS, right? But there are probably some things that you know now that you've spent maybe hundreds of hours learning that no one's going to care about in 5 years, or no one's going to care about in 10 years. So these things change. So when IBM bought SPSS, I was suddenly a very tiny part of a tiny part of a huge company, rather than one of only like 20 trainers in the world that were, considered the ones that they would send to like big clients. I remember spending a month in Australia because there was a particular skill set that I had that the Australian team, very good as they were, didn't happen to know, because they were just further from headquarters. They didn't get to meet the people I was meeting and so on, right? So I knew something was up, but I didn't know, is this career ending? Is it career transition? Is it a good thing because IBM's such a big company? Is it a scary thing? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was a little worried about kind of fear of the unknown. So that's when I started doing personal branding, and that's why it was such a big transition. So I started working on the first book, and you don't need to see the cover of it, but if you did, the guy who invented the software that I was talking about, not SPSS now, but the machine learning one, wrote the foreword. And there were 4, I was probably the least knowledgeable of the 5 authors, but I'm the one that raised my hand and herded cats and got the thing out the door. So I remember like 5 or 6 years after that book came out, I was in the IBM office in New York, and we went around the room doing introductions. I was attending a training on what was new in the new release by the product managers. And I said, oh, I'm Keith, I'm from North Carolina, and I do a lot of SPSS. That was like my intro. And they said, oh, you might not recognize Keith's name. He's the lead author of the Modelware Cookbook. Everybody clapped. They had no idea who I was, but they knew the book, because it was the only book. I mean, the only one, right? So I didn't realize at the time that was like a big deal, like getting all the experts together and kind of like doing the definitive book, because, you don't make a ton on royalties on something like that. But it was career changing because I started getting LinkedIn messages and emails like out of the blue that said, do you consult? So that's when it really became more entrepreneurial, and I realized the power of personal branding, because I mean, every once in a while, somebody will reach out to me about SPSS stuff. I'm actually doing a NIME training this year. I don't train very much at all anymore, but that was really the change. I realized that the book, which took like 2 years, and it was like so hard to do, not just what I had to do, but organizing everybody else's efforts and all that kind of stuff. But that's when it really changed. And I wasn't just the random dude that IBM sent, but people were reaching out to me personally. But again, it would have meant quitting a job at that stage if I hadn't been a freelancer that whole time and hadn't preserved my option to do multiple jobs. So I've got multiple streams of income now. The books are trivial. LinkedIn Learning, not so trivial. It's a substantial fraction of what I make. Conference speaking, the occasional gig that still comes my way. Again, a lot of times it's are you the guy that wrote the book? Are you available to, some of that still happens. Now, more often it's the online courses and the books, but anyway, that's how it all started. So I did have a couple of things that I was going to suggest, and then we'll transition to questions. I've already gone a couple minutes longer than I thought I would. So some overall strategies that have worked for me overall over all these years. If you start from 91, it's been more than 30, right? what fraction of my income has been like salary, what in the US we call W-2 income, but basically salary, income. 10% maybe, I don't know. Most of those years has been completely freelance, which in the US we sometimes call 1099 income, because that's the tax form you get when you're a freelancer, as opposed to a W-2, which is the tax form you get if you're on salary. So if you're international, you might not know those phrases. You might have different names for them, like casual worker and things like that, right? But I found that being a freelancer was critical because it allowed me to do more than one job at once. It allowed me to do all kinds of other things that I couldn't have done otherwise. Be transparent. I told you that story, super important. Be incredibly loyal. You only can endanger a relationship once. It's very rare in the freelance world that you ever get a chance to repair that. I've seen situations where people get, someone thinks somebody's stealing a client or whatever, and then maybe 5 years later they're cordial enough to like shake their hand, but they'll never work together again, right? So you got to be so important about that. Choose your battles. Be willing to walk away from a gig. That's definitely something I've learned over the years. Retain your IP. That could be a whole workshop on just that, but when I've done slide presentations or those kinds of things, I'm very careful about when it's for a particular entity, like a conference, or for an employer and it belongs to them, because a lot of times that same IP is in the book, that's in the workshop, that's in the online course. So you have to become knowledgeable about that. Again, that could be like a whole workshop, but intellectual property is incredibly important if you're going to do this as a business, as opposed to being an employee. Personal branding, I think that speaks for itself. And then something I've discovered just since shutdown, just since 2020, all my conference speaking was canceled. That was going to be a non-trivial fraction of my income. It was probably going to be a third of my income in 2020. I'm not sure, but it was enough that it was like, wow, what's happening, right? So I started to think, well, maybe I wonder if there are jobs right here in town. There are companies right here in town that I should be networking with. It really started as a networking question. I wasn't really seeking a role, because even though a third of your income is a really big hit, it wasn't like I wasn't paying the bills. I just was like, something's going on and it's a little scary. So I took on a half-time role, and they were advertising a full-time role for a junior data scientist. But I said, would you consider a half-time role, somebody more senior? I said, after all, you want them to give talks at conferences and speak on panels? And I said, when I was 24, nobody was offering me a chance to sit on a panel. So, maybe a more senior person, half-time, actually makes more sense. They were persuaded. I did it. That was a role that you could see on my LinkedIn called Cloud Factory. Cloud Factory had a little bit of a rough time a year and a half later, and there were like a bunch of layoffs, and that's like a whole story. But for that year and a half, I said, this is actually kind of interesting, doing consulting on my own, but doing conference speaking and AI evangelism, that was my role, half-time. This is actually kind of cool. And there's all kinds of tax benefits and health benefits too of being half-time with an organization, but then still freelancing. And again, transparency, transparency, transparency. So that worked so well that that I've stayed open to that possibility. And I'm actually in a similar situation now in my current role. You look at LinkedIn, I'm a data scientist for a company called Further. This is just within the last few weeks, but I'm part-time. It's right on my link time that I'm part-time. Everybody at Further knows that I'm part-time. And you don't want to do the same job in two places. That's a horrible idea. Even the perception of overlap is a problem. Again, it gets into the client situation and everything. So I do no consulting on my own anymore, except clients I've had for forever that I stay in touch with. But I don't seek out any new consulting on my own to keep that really separate. So all my consulting is through Further because it's a consultancy. It's the nature of what they do. But the LinkedIn Learning, online courses, and some conference speaking is on my own. One more thing that I hadn't mentioned. Right around that IBM buyout period, when I was just kind of nervous about my career, I worked for an IBM partner for a year and a half. But I still don't know quite what I was thinking. It was a positive experience in many ways, but it really was a life lesson. They said, hey, we want you to run a team. think about it. I never had pursued the PhD, so I didn't have a data science degree because they didn't exist. This had all been bootstrapped and learning on the job. So it was kind of flattering, to be reached out to say to run a team. But that was basically sever all of your relationships. No more conference speaking, right? The book stuff, okay, we'll let you do like a new edition or whatever. But you basically got to sever all of those relationships. Your time is us. And that was the, text message from the boss in the middle of the night kind of a gig, right? That went for about a year and a half. It was just, it was a positive experience, but I could tell if I stayed another couple of years, it was going to be a burnout kind of a thing. It was just too intense. So I had to rebuild those relationships for like a year after leaving that role. I was, hey, I'm back, never again, right? So now I think post-COVID, we have options that we didn't have back then, but that's why, mid-50s now, so I can kind of see out to the next horizon line. It's very unlikely that I would ever be full-time again between now and retirement because I wouldn't want to have to sever a whole bunch of connections and then after that role ending, whatever role it might be, having to start up again. I just would never do that again. So anyway, there we go. That was I spoke longer than I thought I would, but I hope I gave you a lot of food for thought, and I would love to take questions now.
Yeah, let's thank Keith for sharing the story and all those great insights. I took a lot of notes, but let's open it up for Q&A. I'll give other people a chance to ask their questions because I know I have a ton. Yeah, Matthias, go ahead.
Hello, how are you? My name is
good.
Matthias. I'm from Argentina. I'm starting the world of freelancing through platforms such as Upwork. And I would like to know, what about going outside of your comfort zone in order to get new clients? Is it a good idea or not? For example, I'm working now as a BI analyst, but trying to take jobs from machine learning or data science. I'm not quite sure if I will be able to handle them, but I know I can learn.
Well, a couple of things to think about. First, something to think about freelancing in general. You've got to make sure that your compensation when you're freelancing is at least twice what your salary would be, right? So, and this ends up being super important, and it's related. So I promise, Matthias, I'll get to your question more directly, but it's related to that because basically you have to subsidize your own professional development is what I'm getting at. So anywhere in the world, generally, you can find some kind of salary study, for what data scientists at various ranges are doing, right? If you're coming at this more from the BI and the IT side, but you're transitioning to data science, then there's probably some job description out there somewhere that gives you some idea, maybe like a data steward type role, where they're on a data science team, but they're doing more like the IT BI side. I'm not sure. You have to kind of figure that out for yourself. But then as best you can figure out what that daily comp is, then you really got to double that, to figure out what your freelance comp would be. And I think that's where sometimes I'm not sure. I just don't know enough about those platforms. I've researched them a little bit because I talk about them in a two and a half minute video on the side hustle, that they can be a way of building a portfolio, but I'm not sure if the comp achieves that. Now, the reason that extra comp is so important, and you got to, of course, factor in living expenses and market prices throughout the world. There's a whole bunch of other things. You're going to be subsidizing your own professional development. And then what you have to make sure that you don't do is that if you raise your hand and you tell a client, I'm willing to take on this particular project, and you don't quite yet have all the skills you need to do it, I mean, one, it's inevitable that that's going to happen to all of us. Because like right now, for instance, I'm doing all this. I've been trying to figure out transformers, right? Because I've been working with neural nets since the late 90s, but gosh, they were not the same in the late 90s as they are now. Architecture wasn't a thing. It was all the hidden layer, which was just this mysterious, thing. So I'm constantly doing professional development, but you've got to be earning enough so that at least 20% of your time, let's say, is constant professional development. So that helps you do it. And then when you raise your hand and you tell a client that you're going to take on something and you know that you've got to do some professional development to pull it off, make sure that you're fair to the client and you're billing them only for the work and not for the professional development. Because if you tried to get away with it, it's very tempting, right? Because we've all got to pay the bills. And you think, man, I'm only going to be able to end up billing 20 hours this week because I've spent so much damn time on this professional development, right? But you're going to maybe get away with that once, where you send an invoice that is fair. No one could really question it, but you kind of know that it's a little padded because some of that time was you know, trying to compensate yourself for some of these new skills, unless it's specific to the client. You know, they had some weird inconsistency between two systems or something, and you're solving it really for them. If it's professional development for you, you've got to afford to take the time, and you can't make that billable. I know that's a lot to throw out there, but there's a lot to think about it. So yes, I would encourage you to do it under those conditions. And it's inevitable that we'll all have to at some point.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's a great question, Matias. Any other questions? Feel free to raise your hand or even drop it in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Alvin.
Hi, Keith.
Hi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for like such valuable information you have packaged in a very short time. So thank you so much for that. Just wanted to know like how important you think niching down in your some kind of domain, like how important to niche down while you're doing the freelance.
Well, you know, there's somebody that I've grown very fond of and learned a lot from. Shaw's heard this name. There's a woman named Dory Clark, who is not a data scientist. She's a communication expert. She wrote a book called The Long Game. She also wrote a book called Reinventing You. Anyway, she's become a friend. She's really amazing. But one of the things that she talks about in her community, which is the recognized expert community, of which I'm a member, is when to go niche and when to go broad. And there's no one answer. You probably will go through cycles, okay? So I think it's fair to say that I started out by going niche, but it wasn't really by choice, right? It was, hey, I'm doing this grad school thing, and someone's offered me a chance to train out of the blue, you know, like an SPSS. So I went total niche. I mean, I went as broad as you could go within that one world. I knew everything there was to know about that one software package, but just that. But then when the IBM thing happened, I was like in a panic. I mean, I didn't have any specific reason to be in a panic, but I was like, wow, what if I have to find a job that doesn't use SPSS, right? So, I mean, I think you really have to think of it as going through cycles, and you're going to have to follow your gut, right? But going niche is great because, frankly, I think most of us that do some kind of social media, Shaw, I bet you have an opinion on this too, you have to go somewhat niche, at least in cycles, because if you're completely general, your outreach to the world won't be super engaging, right? But if you don't occasionally go more broad, then at some point you're going to be in a panic because all of your social media efforts were on one platform, or all of your training was all on one platform, right? And we think of, you know, pandas and some other things as being so important to the field that they'll never like change. Well, you know, over 33 years, I've seen a lot of things change that looked like they were never going to change, right? So we really don't know what the world will be like in 10 years. You know, even Fei-Fei Li and Jeff Hinton didn't realize how big a deal Transformers were going to be in 2017. They knew wow, this was like an important paper, this attentional you need paper, but even the experts didn't know in 2017 that it would be like what it is now, right? Yeah, so I know that's a roundabout answer, but you've got to find a way to do both.
Makes sense. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I feel like that's a really important question, and your experience with SPSS, I think we can all kind of learn from that. You know, it probably seemed like this thing that's going to be around forever, but technology changes. That's the one constant. Yeah, Abu, go ahead.
Chris, thanks for your time. What do you think about scalability? Like, I mean, you work it alone, like, but there is some freelancers maybe like they want to, for example, if you have, there is a project where maybe you can't solve it alone, like, for example, like transition to an agency. What is your take on that? I kind of
no, that's yeah, and that didn't come up, but I've definitely had some experiences along that way. So I was never tempted to be a founder, for instance. If any of you follow my LinkedIn, you may have noticed that this new role that I'm in, was a role that I joined through acquisition. Okay, so I belonged to a small consultancy that had, just a handful of us, but founded by amazing younger guy, younger than me. And, by that I mean in his 30s, who went the founder route. The thing is, if you're going to go the founder route, you got to do things that I just didn't choose to do, interviewing. So therefore, you've got these employee relationships, but now you get employees whose livelihood and their mortgages and rent depend upon, like you, right? But also all kinds of things like accounting and then fundraising and all that kind of stuff. It's just like a different life. So I didn't go that route. But you're right, scalability becomes an issue. So one of the things that I learned early on, and it's kind of related to the earlier questions about niche and some of these other things is, and also the earlier question, Matthias's question about professional development, it's all related, right? At a certain point, somebody's going to come along and I'm either going to need to do a heck of a lot of professional development or I'm going to have to delegate in some way. But freelancers, if they form a network, will partner on things. So I learned early on that there were some gigs that came along. If it meant that I was going to have to spend the weekend reading up on something new, that's one thing. If I needed to, for a month, do professional development to learn a new skill, then that's like a different story. So you have a bunch of options. You can give it to another freelancer and work out a finder's fee. That can work. You can work the gig together. There are a number of different ways to do it. So I found that I preferred to partner rather than hire, and they're both viable options. But if you're going to do the freelance thing, again, transparency, 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 right? I'm giving you this gig because this is a client that I care about. They like me, okay? If they're a close friend, you might even give it to them with no finder's fee. Just like, hey, if you take care of my client for me and I can trust you, you're going to do an amazing job, gig is yours. And I've had some of those situations over the years. Or can we split it? Let me do the part of the job that I can do and you can do the part of the job that I can't do, right? There are all kinds of ways to do that, but you've got to be super transparent and you've got to be loyal to those other freelancers. And if you're loyal to them, they will tend to be loyal to you. But again, just one violation of trust and it's over. But you can go the partnership route. You don't have to hire or subcontract. Because partnering is different than subcontracting. Subcontracting would be it stays on my paper and I'm paying them to do something. And conceivably, the client doesn't even know that the subcontractor is there. That's a different route. But I've often found that partnering is the way to go, because if you haven't closed the deal yet, if you get on a call with you, the client, and the partner and say, hey, I brought in my partner. I've known this individual for 8 years, 10 years, in my case, maybe 18 or 28, it will help you close the deal. So that's part of it too, whether it's pre-sales or you've already done it. Hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it's a really important question as well. And then one thing I'm curious about with scalability, do you feel like your decision or preference of staying small has been a major contributor to your longevity? Like, do you think if you tried to scale maybe too early or maybe gone down that road, it would have ended, maybe you wouldn't have lasted as long as you did?
Well, I think it is fair to say that if you're a founder and you hire and you escalate in some other way, like getting a loan or something, that's a one-way trip. I'm not saying that it's going to end well or badly. It could be either, right? But once you start to scale in that way, there's no scaling back. Whereas I can partner with somebody and take on a gig that maybe is a career milestone, maybe my first six-figure gig or something like that, right? And then after that, if I've gone the freelance route, I might be like, well, I need 2 weeks of nothing after those 10 intense months of that gig, right? You get paid, your partner gets paid, and then you just block off the calendar. So I think it's partly a personality thing. The ability that, generally speaking, for 3 decades now, that I can, and this is still true now because my salary role is half-time, right? I can look at the calendar 6 months from now and say, I want to take 10 days at Thanksgiving or something. that I can do that. And founders generally can't, right? So it's a life choice, a big one.
All right, let's see. We got Ansel's question that came through chat. How do you balance your time between advancing your professional skills and actively promoting your services and seeking employment opportunities? At what point did you realize that you had acquired enough professional development to effectively handle the projects you've undertaken?
It's a really important question. So I have an interesting anecdote for you. Let's see here. One of my favorite books is it? Yeah, here we go. I found it. This is a little. Most people would probably consider this a little bit out of date now, but you see this Data Mining Techniques, 3rd edition, right? Okay. So when I was, I think it was like 99 or 2000. I mean, I know that because I can guess based on what I was doing in those years, right? So the 3rd edition wasn't out yet. Michael Berry is retired now. Gordon Linoff, he was the head of the B2B team, B2B data science team at TripAdvisor, so very senior, accomplished guy. Linoff was at the New York Times, and I think he's still working now. I don't think he's retired yet, but anyway. So Michael Berry was in my software class, and he was already an expert. His 1st edition was already out at that point, but he didn't know the software. So I recognized who he was, and it was kind of fun because at the end of each chapter, I'd let him have his little 2-minute statement about his thoughts, his 2 cents on the topic that we had just covered. Okay, so the reason I brought this up is that he made a comment that really stuck with me at the time. He said, you're really effective in the classroom. I'm enjoying the class, which was very flattering coming from an expert. So that was pleased. But he took me aside privately and he said, I'm a little bit surprised that you're training and not consulting, because generally speaking, there's a little bit more prestige, more than a little really, associated with consulting versus training. And I said, well, the thing is though, I'll probably do 180 training days this year for them. That's a lot of days. If you figure out how many work days there are in a year, that's a lot of days being a freelancer. Remember, I told you your comp by the day has to be more than what your salary would be. Otherwise, you're going to run into trouble, right? But I was young. I was just starting out. So I wasn't doing things like professional development. Well, I kind of was in that if I taught Monday through Wednesday, I'd stick around and sit in on other classes. And of course, they didn't care. They all knew me in the office. I would just sit in the back row and I'd sit on these other classes so that I was always doing it. But the reason I'm bringing this up related to professional development is when he made that comment, I said, I know that you're very successful. I doubt that you're billing, you and your consulting partner, like 22 business days a month. He said, oh no, I mean, if we consistently did half that, right, we'd be doing like amazing, because you've got to sell and you've got to do all these other things, right? So that was a big difference between being a freelancer, where there was really almost no entrepreneurial aspect to it. It was just how I was getting paid. I was getting paid by the day. I wasn't really entrepreneurial. I was purely freelancer. To what he was doing, which was he was really only billing about half the time. So that gives you a rough idea. That's why your comp has to be 2 to 3 times as much to subsidize those kinds of activities. So I think generally speaking, what you do is you bill as many days as you can, but you've got to be on it. If you find that you've got a Friday off because you're not billable, it's so tempting to just say, oh, long weekend, I really need to chill. You got to just force yourself to do something on the marketing or the professional development side for like part of that day, but what they did is the days that they weren't billable, they wrote. And he said that's how they started. That was the other thing he said that day that really, really stuck with me. He said on the days that the phone wasn't ringing in the early days of their consultancy, and at first there's a lot of those days, they wrote and they chipped away at it and they chipped away at it. And they said, our calendar's been full ever since the first book came out, So, and that's the other thing about a book. If you try to do some math on the royalties and you divide what your royalties are going to be by the hundreds of hours it's going to take you to write a book. I mean, imagine how many hours it takes 2 people to write this book. I don't even want to know. It's probably 300 hours each or something insane, right? If you take your royalties and you divide by the number of hours, you're just going to be in tears, right? But 1 gig, even one week or 2 week gig with a client is more than a year's worth of royalties. I mean, more than 2 years worth of royalties, right? So if you write a book and you get 2 gigs a year or even 1 gig a year out of the book, you've made your money back, but you're not going to make it back from royalties. So that's another way to think about it. You got to have some kind of a game plan. Okay, I woke up this morning and I'm not billable today. Sure, go for a walk, chill out for like an hour or two and enjoy the fact that you're not billable today, but then get to work and do something. Social media to generate business, or just sit down and write, even if you don't even know what you're going to do with it. Do something. You got to chip away at that. So 2020 turned out to be an incredibly important year for me because, for the first 2 weeks of shutdown, I can't remember what I watched on Netflix, but I watched like 3 seasons of something, and just it felt like a snow day. I grew up in a snowy part of the world, so I felt like, hey, I've got this time. But after that, it was like, okay, I don't know how long this is going to last, but what are my professional development goals? And no one knew that February, March, how long it was going to last. But it's basically when I wrote the 2 causality courses, during that time. I actually probably ended up doing something like 6 or 8 LinkedIn learning courses in 2020. Which would be impossible if I hadn't started doing LinkedIn learning courses in 2016, because I knew what I was doing. I had relationships, right? But I would never in a million years be able to do 6 or 8 courses in a year if I maintain the travel schedule that I normally do. Again, a lot of these answers are kind of roundabout, but these are all really important issues. How much time, how do you carve up your time? How do you deal with scale? Do you take on gigs that are going to be a little bit challenging or maybe intimidatingly so, right? You're asking great questions.
Yeah, I think it's a really important distinction, like the freelancer versus the consultant. Like freelancer, you're just kind of like plugging into something, but a consultant, you got to think about business development, professional development, selling yourself, etc. All right, so we're a little over time. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to Keith on LinkedIn or elsewhere. We will share the recording on the YouTube channel, and there maybe some other ways we can get you in touch with Keith. I also want to call out that next week we have another event where Amir will be talking about AI product development with LLMs. So if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to check out the events calendar and register for that. But with that, I just want to thank Keith again for taking the time and sharing his knowledge and all the hard-learned lessons over the years. And then thanks everyone in the audience for joining.
I'm going to just put my LinkedIn in the chat to make it easy.
Perfect. So check out Keith's LinkedIn. Make sure you follow him and keep up with all the amazing LinkedIn learning courses and all the other content he's putting out. All right, guys. Thanks again for your time. We'll see you in the next one.